Okay, so today we're going to look at our intro paragraphs again, and specifically with an eye on proofreading. So obviously, we've spent the last three classes talking about what goes in a first paragraph, and that stuff is really important. But I also want you to be able to look for some pretty common grammar mistakes. And so this presentation is going to focus on not so much the structure of the first paragraph, but some common mistakes that I see in your writing and how to notice them and how to fix them both in our papers and to help our proofreading partners' papers. So let's go through proofreading a first paragraph. Okay, so first there's some sentence issues that a lot of you are having right away. First thing is that we have to remember that the title of any work that's published as a whole, in this case a novel, is either underlined or in italics. The title of any work that's published as part of a larger collection is in quotes. So if you're talking about like a CD, then that is in italics. If you're talking about a song, then that is in quotes. This is why you often hear that poetry is in quotations, because poetry is almost never published as its own work. It's usually part of a larger collection, whereas a novel is definitely published as a whole. So the first thing to keep track of is that when you use the author, the title of the book, a separate piece, you want to make sure that you're either underlining it or putting it in italics. And it almost goes without saying, but of course you also want to have the words capitalized, right? A separate piece. Okay, on to the next topic. Often, and this is going to get a little grammatical, but your first sentence will include a non-essential appositive. And if you do use a non-essential appositive, you need commas around that appositive phrase, which means, of course, that we have to understand what a non-essential positive is. Let's talk about what a non-essential positive is. Okay, so first let's talk about what an appositive phrase is. An appositive phrase renames the noun right beside it. So think of it as a redundant renaming of something that you just said. Almost always as a test, you can drop either the appositive or the noun it is renaming, and the sentence is still grammatically correct. Okay, so the two things about it, think of appositive means a renaming, and it also is, you can drop it, and the sentence is still grammatically correct. So let's look at some appositives. Okay. A Separate Piece, a novel by John Knowles, is my favorite book. Okay, so A Separate Piece is my favorite book. I kind of renamed A Separate Piece here. I renamed it A Novel by John Knowles. Okay, so this, A Novel by John Knowles, is an appositive, because I could either say A Separate Piece is my favorite book, or A Novel by John Knowles is my favorite book. And so because I renamed A Separate Piece, think of it as extra information, but in this case, since it's an appositive, it's also a noun phrase, so it's taking the place, or it could potentially take the place of the noun. Let's look at another. Spot, my dog, ruined the house. So I could say Spot ruined the house. I could say my dog ruined the house. And so my dog in this case is an appositive. It's renaming Spot. My brother, Dan, lives in Philly. Okay, I could say my brother lives in Philly. I could say Dan lives in Philly. Okay, so in all of these cases, I rename the noun phrase, and I'm doing it with an appositive phrase. Okay, so that's what an appositive is. And in fact, this is the sentence that's going to be on a lot of your writing. But let's make sure we understand the difference between an appositive and a non-essential appositive. Because a non-essential appositive is the only time that you need the commas. Okay. A non-essential appositive is not needed to identify the noun, whereas an essential appositive is needed to identify the noun. If you take away a non-essential appositive, nobody's going to ask which one are you talking about. Oops, look, there's an error right there. So I'm proofreading my own. Which one are you talking about? My brother, Dan, lives in Philly. This is grammatically correct if Dan is a non-essential appositive. But in a way that might seem confusing, it's also okay to say my brother Dan lives in Philly. What's the difference between these two sentences? This, since it's being treated as a non-essential appositive, because it's set off by commas, implies that I only have one brother. I'm saying my brother lives in Philly. And because I'm treating this like a non-essential appositive, I'm saying that there is no need for this to identify my brother. If I say my brother Dan lives in Philly, and I'm treating this as an essential appositive, because notice I don't have the commas, then essentially I'm saying I have more than one brother. If I drop Dan, you would say which brother? And I would say my brother Dan. So even though Dan is an appositive here, and Dan is an appositive here, in the first sentence, Dan is a non-essential appositive, and in the second sentence, Dan is an essential positive. And obviously it just depends on, if you trust that I'm grammatically correct, you would read the two sentences differently. But it's only the non-essential appositives that are surrounded by commas. Okay, so look at the difference. A Separate Piece, a novel by John Knowles. As we already talked about, this is a non-essential appositive, because I could just say a separate piece is the story. I don't have to say a separate piece, a novel by John Knowles is the story. If I dropped a novel by John Knowles, you wouldn't say which a separate piece are you talking about. Whereas if I said John Knowles' novel, a separate piece now is the appositive. Okay, I named it by John Knowles' novel, and I could have said John Knowles' novel is one of my favorite. The problem is, without the title, you would say which novel are you talking about? The novel, a separate piece. So because John Knowles has many novels, the title of the novel is essential and doesn't need commas. Whereas there's only one a separate piece. So the name of the author is non-essential. It might be important information, but it just means that it's not needed to identify the noun that I'm talking about. Okay, so that's a really long-winded way of saying if you have a non-essential appositive, you surround it by commas. Whew. Okay, well, we'll come back to appositives later, but that's good enough for you to proofread. Other rules. We never refer to the author by only the first name. Okay, so we write Knowles describes how Phineas climbs. We don't write John describes how Phineas climbs. Okay, so it's just a writing convention for these formal academic papers. We only refer to the noun. You can say John Knowles describes, but it's fine to use the author's last name. It's not okay to only use his first name. So watch out for that in the papers. You want to avoid first and second person pronouns. So let's talk about the way you can avoid them. Most of the time, you can avoid I statements by just dropping the statement. It's usually not even a very necessary clause. I feel that the author depicts the setting becomes the author depicts the setting. I think, I believe, all these I statements. Now, if you're using them in a quote, obviously it's okay to use I, but you shouldn't ever use I in your paper unless it's part of a quote. It's just, we know you think it, right? We know you feel it because it's your paper and you're saying it. So all it really does is weaken the writing because it makes it sound not objective. It makes it sound like it's just your opinion. Okay. If you have a group pronoun, replace it with the group. So often in our culture, we talked about this before, but as a reminder, our culture implies the reader and the writer. So if you are writing our culture and somebody's reading it in India, they're not going to know what our culture means. So our is a difficult pronoun because it's defining a group that the reader is going to help define, but you don't really know the reader, and the reader doesn't necessarily know your, so just replace it with often in, and then whatever you meant by our culture. So you could have said often in modern American culture. So you can drop that group pronoun, our, with just the group that it represents. Same thing with we. Okay, you can just replace it with what you mean by we. And then very common when we talk is to use you, but instead use the reader or one. There's a lot of other ways to avoid using the word you. So we don't say, when you first encounter Jean. Instead you say, when the reader first encounters Jean. Okay, so it's better to keep, I mean, it's common to use the phrase you first encounter, but you don't mean the reader specifically. You mean a reader or the reader as a kind of hypothetical kind of being or whatever. So drop the you, drop the I, drop the we, drop the our. Okay, you can use second and you can use third person pronouns, obviously he, she, they, but we don't want to use first or first person pronouns or second person pronouns. Okay, so that gives you a lot to chew. And to remind us of the major points, there was only 4 I asked you to look for. Okay, I want you to title the work right. Make sure that you're underlining it or italicizing it. I want you to watch out for non-essential appositives. Okay, and for what those are. I want you to not refer to the author by only the first name. And I want you to avoid first and second person pronouns. In addition to that, I want you to make sure that you're paying attention to all the structural things that we looked at last week. Okay, so in the remaining half an hour, you have just enough time to go through 2 people's papers, and your wonderful proctor will tell you the structure for that. Remember, your second attempt at these at this first paragraph is due tomorrow, and there's a spot on Moodle where you can upload it. Thanks and good luck.